Yohana calls transitions to the new. Because he talks about the creativity of God acting at the transition points, say, to new species. And I would say, well, why is God especially acting here? It sounds like if God is not intervening, which he seems to be saying he's not, or she's not, why? He talks of a pressure. What does this pressure mean? I don't understand what he's trying to say. So there's a sort of disjunction between his understanding of Christ as kind of emerging, as it were, but also this particular action at transition points. So I don't quite see how the two fit together. Maybe some other people can help me. Is there something then radically new inaugurated at the resurrection? I would say the answer to that is yes. But then we've got the problem in interventionist language. Of course, if we talk about the radical transformation within, then it sounds like something new. But how are we to interpret that? What are we really trying to say? So the resurrection then, I think we can say is transformative. But perhaps we need to go further than that, and with Bob Russell, say that Easter is the first instantiation of a new law of nature, because of course that very neatly gets around the problem of both wanting something new, but also this not being interventionist language. So I think that's a very useful way of thinking about it. By that he means, and no doubt he'll be able to explain more clearly than I can, that there's a different set of laws of nature, laws that haven't yet been discovered by science, that are somehow initiated at Easter. And at the final resurrection, these new laws will be found to be more fully present, of course. I'm not sure whether, well, as far as I'm concerned, I don't think that it's possible at this stage to discover those laws, and maybe you would say, want to argue with that, but I don't think that's really relevant. What's relevant is a way of thinking about this theologically, but also a way of thinking about it in a way that still makes sense to contemporary science. And I think that, or could make sense if scientists are open-minded enough to say, well, maybe there are things we haven't discovered yet. Whether we could ever discover them or not, I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not a physicist, so perhaps someone could help me. The redemption of nature, then, I'd say that we have to look at the cross and the resurrection together. And this is something I've got from Jürgen Moltmann. So although I've been critical with him, I'm also extremely appreciative. And I think it's very important to both appreciate as well as criticise the authors that we engage with, because we may find problems with some of the things they say. But even in engaging with them, I think we need to show some respect. And certainly I have a huge admiration for Moltmann's intention to link both cross and resurrection together, the atonement with resurrection hope. So full participation of creaturely Sophia and divine Sophia will happen once nature is redeemed. So we can see also that full participation of creaturely Sophia and divine Sophia in the person of Christ. So in that sense, it's an instantiation of something new, where creaturely Sophia and divine Sophia are perfectly matched. There's no shadow, as it were, there anymore. Redemption is an ontological transformation within. I don't think it really matters whether these are new laws or an extension of existing laws. That's not the point of what I'm trying to say here. But there's a sense in which that participation helps us understand what's going on. And then Romans 8 will remind us that the whole of the natural world waits confidently rather than anxiously. So the resurrection of Christ then brings a new beginning for creation. The longing of creation expressed in Romans 8 is then satisfied in the redemption of nature. And the love of God for all of creation, including the animals, beyond their usefulness to humanity, becomes self-evident. I haven't filled out in detail how I think the next world, if you like, would express God's love for animals and love for humans. I think that is a topic for another paper. All I'm trying to do here is to show that the two need to be considered alongside one another. We can't just focus in on the atonement and then not consider redemption. We can't just focus in on redemption and not consider the atonement. And with that, I think run my course. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Celia. We have time for some Q&A. I'll invite the respondents, the six of you first, to field questions, and then break in about 15-20 minutes for so.
You know what? Up to now,
Yes.
You use the word Sophia a great deal. How do you define Sophia in this case, and how do you define shadow Sophia?
Okay. Sophia is wisdom. Divine.
You're simply using another word.
Yes, Sophia just is wisdom. I'm using Sophia because that's what is common in much theological discussion of wisdom. They use Sophia, which is what's Greek for wisdom.
You're using it very generally. And what is shadow Sophia?
Well, I want to come to what wisdom is first. I want to say that I'm adopting Bulgakov's understanding of there being two aspects to Sophia, both creaturely Sophia and divine Sophia, and the two being sort of interrelated with one another. And creaturely Sophia most is linked with Proverbs 8. You know, I was by creaturely, wisdom is talked about in Proverbs 8 as being created by God, ever at play with creation, ever at play with God in creation, and that sense of playfulness of Sophia, creaturely Sophia in the created world happens right from the very earliest moments of time. So, but at the same time, the wisdom of God, as it were, is there as an ideal, but also, I would say, an ontological aspect of who God is, not just love is part of who, understood as an integral aspect of who God is. So Sophia is also that. Now, Bulgakov was quite controversial in Orthodox terms, talking about the ousia of God. Sophia is the ousia, or the being of God. On that basis, some people have said you shouldn't talk about wisdom as the ousia of God, because the wisdom of God is the energia, or the energies of God, and so we need to distinguish that from who God is and God's self. He tried to get round this by talking about the absolute God, God as absolute. So he said there is an absolute God. In other words, there's a sense in which we can't understand God in God's fullness. There's always an unapproachableness to God, an apophatic tradition, as well as a cataphatic tradition. So he did try and address that particular problem, but some authors like Vladimir Losky and others felt he didn't do that sufficiently. And that is very, very, very short summary of wisdom. The shadow Sophia is, if you like, only appearing with creaturely Sophia, and creaturely Sophia is obviously involved in the creation. Shadow Sophia, as I understand it from Bulgakov, is the privation of the good. But Shadow Sophia, as I'm trying to interpret it here, goes beyond that, and if you like, has a number of different elements. In other words, all the different facets of evil that we find today, we can think of that and their interrelationship with one another as being aspects of Shadow Sophia. So anthropogenic evil are effects on the natural world. Natural evil, or in other words, the degree of extinctions and so on that we find horrendous, of volcanoes and so on and so forth, as well as moral evil, all of those can be brought under the umbrella of Shadow Sophia. So just as wisdom is an interrelating capacity, we see wisdom as being able to combine different aspects of our human life and relate one to the other. So I would say that Shadow Sophia, in my interpretation, which obviously goes beyond Bulgakov, has this capacity to interrelate to all these different elements and try and bring them together. So we're not just saying, as many people say, oh well, the way we get around theodicy is to say it's a free process defence, or it's a veil of soul making, or something like that. I would say that that evil and our response to it in the Odyssey has a number of different elements in it that needs to be brought together in a way which is helpful. And for that reason, I've been offering this idea of Shadow Sophia. And in addition to that, that say may sound a little bit speculative, but I think we can ground it in the biblical account of Dame Folly. So we can identify Shadow Sophia with Dame Folly in the Old Testament, this idea that there is always this alternative that is kind of there. And I'd say that how far we take it, how far we say, in what sense it be ontological or not, I think, or constitutive, I think it's a matter for discussion. But I think that a strong element of it is this privation of the good, but there are other facets to it as well. And I say this is kind of work in progress, and I hope it's helpful in order to fill out what I call the tapestry of evil.
Sorry, can you say in just a few words what Shadow Sophia is?
That's what I've just been talking about.
What is it? That's what she I was going to say it very briefly because I don't understand.
Okay. Sophia is creaturely wisdom, right? Sophia is creaturely wisdom. Shadow Sophia is, if you like, the dark side of creaturely wisdom, a privation of the good that we find in creaturely wisdom. So that's the most important element of Shadow Sophia.
Contrast.
It's the how can you say? I don't know how to put it more clearly. Maybe someone else could help me, because I'm doing my very best to explain this as far as I can. Sometimes the classic scholars, such as Aquinas, thought of evil as not being a substance, but as being, if you like, where those who aim at good, if you like, get deflected. And it's a form of non-being. So just as Sophia talks about creaturely being, a sort of the non-being, if you like, the underlying sort of non-existence, if you like, is talked about as a shadow. And so this means the privation of the good, or what good isn't. So in other words, what it is not. So what good is not is the shadow. And so that, in a way, is a way of trying to understand what evil is. Now you could say, well, is this adequate? Because it's almost like talking of evil is illusionary. It doesn't really have any concrete existence, because it's a shadow. So on that basis, Shadow Sophia, if you like, is there, but it's not really there. So, but there are other ways of thinking about evil, and what evil means, and I'm trying to bring them together in this concept of Shadow Sophia.
I suggest the respondents have the first one to ask them questions. So, any hands from them right now? Okay, I'll ask one then. How does Shadow Sophia relate to Augustine's sense of evil as a privation of good?
Well, because I've just been talking yeah. Augustine's understanding of the privation of the good is this is what evil means. Evil means something that good is not. In other words, we can't actually name evil as a substance. And I think the advantage of this, of course, is then God is not ultimately responsible for evil. It's rather like some of C.S. Lewis's writing, when he talked about hell as being those of us who maybe don't respond to the goodness of God. So it's, in a sense, that God is not responsible for that, people existing in hell. Now, I think the language of hell isn't very necessary here, but the idea is that it's non-being, the existence of non-being. Now, Bulgakov seems to call Shadow Sophia, seems to talk about Shadow Sophia in ways that are quite similar to Augustine. The difference, as I see it, it seems to be related to his sense of continuity with the creaturely world, which I'm trying to hint at, but also because he has this interplay of creaturely wisdom and divine wisdom in a way that Augustine doesn't. So he matches up the shadow or the privation of good with something specific, in this case, creaturely wisdom. So so it's more specifically related to wisdom in his thinking, whereas he also talks, of course, about evil as well in general terms. So he doesn't just talk about shadows of fear, he talks about evil in very general terms, in terms of the privation of the good, and that is very similar to Augustine. So there's a strong relationship between them, but they're not totally identical. Evil is more a sort of general sort of compass. Now I'm finding the idea of shadows of fear helpful in some of these discussions because it links, of course, with creatureliness. And if we're talking about creation and animals and these other things, I think we need something that ties in with our creaturely existence in some way. And I think that's why I find it helpful. But I'm sure there are others.
Okay, questions? No?
Thank you for just a wonderful paper. I'm wondering if you could say a word about how, in this rich understanding of evolution you've offered us, but how we can preserve both a sense of what is radically novel, of a novum, and yet do so in terms that are finally non-interventionist.
Yes.
I'm just wondering about whether Sophia suffices to be able to resolve that kind of antinomy. And I wonder if you could just reflect a little more on can a novum be non-interventionist?
Yes, I mean, I think I tried to hint at that towards the end, where Rob Russell's comments on the new instantaneity of the new laws of nature. I think that the difference is that divine Sophia is fully resonant with creaturely Sophia. And so in that sense, you could say, well, the law, creaturely Sophia hasn't been visible, as it were, to such an extent in the existing laws. But in the new laws of nature, creaturely Sophia operates without a shadow. And so in that sense, you could say that the new laws of nature, in some sense, parallel with creaturely Sophia that expresses divine Sophia in a way that's new. So there is, I do want to say there is a radical newness there, because the shadow is not there anymore. And so in that sense, it's a different order of things. And so but at the same time, there's continuity with the old. So it brings in both the continuity of the old, because creaturely Sophia is there from the beginning, but now creaturely Sophia is fully resonant with divine Sophia and not having the shadow there anymore. This is the instantiation of the new law of nature, because creaturely Sophia has hovered from the beginning of creation, ever at play with God, ever at play in creation. But at that stage, the shadow is there. The shadow is always sort of, if you like, almost following creaturely Sophia, as creaturely Sophia has worked through evolution and on into humanity. In the instantiation of the new laws of nature, creaturely Sophia and divine Sophia will be fully resonant and there'll be no shadow. Now, I don't know how else to express it, because I believe there's an ambiguity there and there's an unknownness to it that we can't fully interpret yet, because we see by faith rather than by sight. And in a sense, our own experience of the risen Christ is one that's existential rather than one that is physical, as it were. And so in that sense, we, if you like, have hints at that, and what one talks about is hints at that through the work of the Holy Spirit. But I mean, again, that's sort of another paper, really.
Thank you.
How would you say your thought corresponds with Teilhard's thought? Because he seems to say the resurrection isn't the final point, it's the omega, because the working out of evolution is a long process in which consciousness itself, which is the within of matter, in other words, he doesn't separate so much material world from consciousness, because room consciousness is the within of the material world. So actually the working out, as Paul says, we fulfill the sufferings of Christ now. We're part of that redemption, which isn't completed until the omega point. Teilhard, of course, was criticized because the Catholic Church said, well, you didn't have enough emphasis on sin. How would you correspond your theory, let's say, to Teilhard's thought?
Yeah, I like that question. I think Teilhard is very interesting. Teilhard, of course, is, as I see it, is almost like a prophet of process theology, process thought. And on that basis, Teilhard sees what's happening in the natural world as a crescendo building up to the omega. I see him operating out of what I call a future-ans philosophy. In other words, it's an emergent philosophy of Christ. Whereas I like the idea of Rana and of Moltmann, this idea of coming to as well as being fulfilled. So now he does talk about the Perusia, of course, and he is influenced by Eastern thought. And on that basis, you could say, well, he does include something of this in his understanding of the yoga. I think that part of the problem with Teilhard is that he does tend, although he has this cosmic understanding of the whole evolutionary process, he does put a very high emphasis on humanity and on the technology of humanity in a way that I would want to address. And so in that sense, thinking it just in terms of human consciousness, of Christogenesis, of anthropogenesis and so on, I think it's rather too focused on the human, and his understanding of evolution is also problematic because he sees it as, if you like, pointing towards humanity all the time, whereas I see it much more as a branch. In other words, his understanding of evolution, as I see it, was somewhat naive, although some other biologists like Ludovico, whose second name I've forgotten about, the Italian biologist. Gallini, yes, thank you. Ludovico Gallini, he actually thinks that Teilhard resonates quite strongly with some of his own understanding of biology. I'm less confident of that. I think his understanding, he does have other aspects to his thought as well, which are interesting. He talks about the eternal feminine, which again I find quite interesting because that also links in with his understanding of Mary. But his understanding of the eternal feminine is restricted to his understanding of the Virgin Mary, rather than, and that eternal feminine is also linked to Sophia, but that is restricted to the Virgin Mary rather than widening out to a more cosmological approach. So I would say that there are certain analogies, but he doesn't have this idea of evil in the same way. He does think about it as privation of good, where he does talk about it, but it's not integral to his discussion, and he doesn't seem to have much time for atonement theory or anything like that. He talks much more about the progress. There's a philosophy of progress that seems to permeate his thinking, rather than something radically new coming in. But he is obviously a scholar that has looked at Christ and evolution, and I could have possibly engaged with him here, but there's only so much time.
Sure.
Could you give examples of good or evil in non-human animals?
Good or
Evil in non-human animals.
yes. I hope, Mark is, I think, going to talk about that as well. I think there are good examples of cooperation between animals, even animals of different species, where they will help one another. For example, some elephants or others have been known to help completely different species if they've been lying there wounded or something in a way that you wouldn't expect simply from evolutionary terms. It's sort of outside what you might expect. So that's chimpanzees as well. And so there seem to be examples of genuine altruism in animals. Evil, again, Jane Goodall's done quite a lot of work on that, and she has found examples of sort of pack behaviours in I think it's in gorillas and others, where they seem to go for a whole group, and almost like go to war, as it were. Now, some of those details I think should be answered by the biologists, but basically there are plenty of examples where you could say, well, yes, this looks like within their own worlds there are examples of a form of morality that we need to take into account.
Could you speak in terms of gradations of altruism? For example, I've read that sailors who are rescued by dolphins, that might be explained by the dolphin's instinct to push its own newborn babies to the surface for air. So could there be, between chimpanzees and dolphins and bonobos and dogs, a range of conscious or unconscious altruism?
Yes. Yeah, I have to admit I've changed my mind on this. And so I say that as a footnote in the paper. when I first started reading about this, and then I read also about what's called naturalistic interpretations. In other words, explanations that said if you see a chimpanzee smile, don't read into it genuine happiness. This is just because they instinctively want to open their mouths when they see something wrong. You know, just what I mean. And I think that the same sort of explanations could be said of dolphins lifting humans up. You know, this is just because they think it's another dolphin young. I think these are attempts at evading the possibility that we need to be open to, that animals can self-reflect and they can operate out of their own worlds in ways which are unique to their own worlds, but also, I would say, have what I call moral latency. In other words, they are resembling, in some sense, us human animals, because we are, after all, animals, social animals as well. And so on that basis, I have changed my mind, but it's been through studying the work of Mark and others that I feel I've come to this shift, because it's very hard if you, well, all you have to do, I think, is go out into the field and sometimes and watch some animals at play and so on. And then you begin to understand that there is something going on here. You know, they're right. So it doesn't jar with my own limited experience of animal observation. If you really pay attention to what's going on in the animal world, and it's been true of many other biologists as well, and you start to see something going on there that can't simply be explained by some sort of instinctive behaviour that's related to their desire for reproductive prowess. But if you do follow that route, then it does something radical about, well then what do we do with this? How should we deal with it theologically? Should we just ignore it, or should we begin to rethink some of our own theological concepts that are being so anthropocentric? And I would say the second. And I want to say that alongside thinking about behaviour that's inappropriate in animals, we also, of course, need to focus on their good behaviour. So, but because many other authors have focused in on altruism in the science-related discussion, I thought, well, what about the other side as well? So I'm not at all wanting an understanding of the possibility of forms of sin that becomes an animal to be the basis of their mistreatment. Certainly not. I'm just wanting to understand their reality and come to see them as maybe having their own worlds which are more resembling the human worlds than perhaps we previously thought, just as our own understanding of rationality now has been turned upside down. We used to think, well, humans are the only reasonable animals, humans are the only animals with language, humans are the only ones that can do X, Y, and Z, and now we have to say, well, perhaps animals also have forms of morality. And I have to say that in the early book I wrote, The Ethics of Nature, I criticised Michael Northcote for this and said, there's no way I can cope with this. I think he's reading into it. But I think there are anthropocentrisms and in other words, anthropomorphisms which are helpful and anthropomorphisms which are unhelpful. The kind of unhelpful anthropomorphisms are the ones that Mary Midgley talks about in Beasts and Man, where she says that, of course, in the earlier centuries, people projected their evil into animal behaviour because they wanted to blame something other than humans. They wanted to see, well, this is just beastly behaviour, as it were. You know, our vices are somehow projected in. And I think that that's an unhelpful anthropomorphism, but there are anthropomorphisms that genuinely chime in with the way animals are. And just as we anthropomorphise about God, if it can be a projection, if we read into God, say, political dimensions that are just true of human social behaviour, but the language of our humanity is the only language we have. We haven't got any other language to use, so we have to talk about God in human language. And in a similar sort of way, we have to talk about God, animals in human language, but that doesn't mean to say that we don't respect their own worlds, just as we respect, as theologians, who God is in God's self. But at the same time, we try and reach for what might be going on by using human language.
It's time for one more. Sorry.
We probably don't have time to go very far with this, but I found the talk really, really good, and the questions you raised really stimulating. Two concepts you either used or referred to atonement and redemption. And I'm wondering, and I'm not coming at this from kind of a new age point of view that sort of humanizing evil and all that sort of stuff, but I'm wondering if you have considered the possibility that those concepts, looking kind of at the big picture of creation and evolution and everything, that those concepts really may not make any sense. And there may not be a need for anything to be atoned or redeemed. If we see everything in some kind of a process towards some kind of completion, in which problems happen, evil happens, and all that sort of thing. But have you considered that or played around with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a very common view of Matthew Fox and others who've talked about original blessing rather than original sin. I criticise him in my book Creation Through Wisdom because I think that if you go straight for blessings without dealing with the problem of sin, we're deceiving ourselves. And I suppose I see that we have to confront what I see as theological reality, which is the possibility of evil, and take that very seriously, because I believe in a God who's not just a good God, but also a holy God. And on that basis, there will be a sense of a need for reconciliation of some sort, where sinful actions are done in a repeated sense. So I think the advantage of creation spirituality is it addressed the opposite tendency, which is to focus on human redemption to the exclusion of the non-human world. But I think if we focus just on creation on its own and without dealing with redemption, without dealing with atonement, then we're also committing the error in the opposite direction. So, and I think that's one of the problems with, say, Teilhard de Chardin's work and many of the other, or some of the other process views that I come across, that they are so fixed in on the positive, which is, of course, helpful on one level, but if it's not actually dealing with what I call the shadow side of reality, then I'm not sure how far it takes us. Well, certainly from my own perspective, I would say that suffering is sufficiently real for me to believe that it's not part of the process. In other words, we can't just see it as part of the process and just accept it. We can't just see cruciform nature as just something we can accept because the future is bright. There has to be a confrontation of that in some way, and in that sense, I would say that the cross actually allows us to confront that evil. But it is, of course, as Paul said, foolishness to the Greeks. You know, there's a sense in which it only really makes sense from the perspective of faith. It can't make sense to a secular philosopher or an atheistic theologian. Some people say, well, there isn't such a thing as an atheist theologian. I think there can be someone who maybe thinks about these things theoretically without having a belief. But I think from the perspective of faith, then there is this need to try and come to terms with it in a way which brings in these models. But it's not to say that we are doing the traditional model of creation for redemption. By looking at this boundary area, we're saying that this understanding of the fall needs to be completely revised and looked at again. And the same with atonement. So it's not like we're going to get rid of them altogether. We are now revising them and rethinking them and reworking them. I don't agree that they can be dispensed with completely. Now, other people may argue with me on that. But I think dispensing with them has its own dangers, which are problematic.
Thanks, Celia. We have about 20 minutes or half an hour for a break and then 2 responses before lunch, so please enjoy the conference.